So, I would like to welcome here everybody at the Faculty of Education and Psychology at Utrecht University, and I'm very proud to introduce you Professor Mark D. Griffiths, who is a professor of the Nottingham Trent University, but also he is honorary doctor and professor of the Utrecht University, as the Senate of our university just awarded this title to Mark. We are very proud of that, and we are very happy that you could come to Budapest again this time, and there will also be a ceremony tomorrow. So it's an open ceremony, so anyone can participate. It's a ceremonial sitting of the Senate, and then this title will be also officially given to Mark. But today is a more professional event, is a possibility to listen to a presentation of Professor Griffiths. I want to be long, and actually if I should tell the whole CV and all the results of Mark, then it would be really a long presentation, so I won't do that. But I really have to mention that Professor Mark Griffiths is one of the most productive and most influential professors of the field, especially the field of addictive behaviors, and specifically like gambling and gaming behavior, but also like exercise addiction and many other issues. We've been working together for several years now, so it's also a very strong relationship has been built between the ELTE and Mark. More PhD students has visited and spent a few months at Nottingham Trent University under the supervision of Mark. We have published numerous papers together with on different topics. So it's really a very fruitful relationship. So we are very proud of that, and we are very happy about that. And yeah, it's a great pleasure that you are here. Just to mention a few issues from really, I promise not to tell the whole CV, but you have to know that Mark is, if I'm correct, the youngest person who has ever become professor at the youngest age in the United Kingdom at an age of 35 years. He's published more than 600 scientific papers in the past decades, and also one of the most cited psychologists in the world, and for sure maybe the most influential person in the fields of addictions, and especially behavioral addictions. So it's really a great pleasure for us to welcome you here, and yeah, and the floor is yours to have this presentation.
Okay, thank you. Can you all hear me at the back? Is this on? Can you all hear me? Yeah? Yeah? Okay. Absolutely delighted to be here today. Thank you to ELTE. I also want to say a special thanks to Attila in the audience as well. I've published with at least 6 or 7 of you in the audience. Really lovely to be here. If you've heard me speak before, and I know some of you have, is that I always joke, which isn't really a joke, but it's true. I can speak at 1 of 3 speeds, which is fast, very fast, and on amphetamines. The thing is, I'm very enthusiastic about what I do, and so if I try to slow down, I just become unnatural. So my speed is nothing to do with nervousness. I really just love talking about my research. Anyone that knows me, I also kind of joke that I'm addicted to publishing papers, which is just about the best addiction you can have being an academic. But what I'm going to do today, I'm mainly going to talk about gambling addiction in relation to behavioural addictions. I mean, obviously will mention other addictions as I go along. I've called it a kind of personal overview, and for those of you who don't know anything about my work, I started doing my PhD in 1987 on slot machine addiction, By 1990, I then went into video game addiction. 1994, I started doing stuff on internet addiction. 1997, I did my first paper on exercise addiction. 2001 was my first paper on sex addiction. 2005 was my first paper on workaholism. A lot of my colleagues have always called me a workaholic, but by my own criteria, I'm going to show you that I'm not a workaholic. And then more recently, I've been doing stuff on things like social networking addiction, and Jolt and myself and some other colleagues, we recently published papers on things like dancing addiction, believe it or not. And I've obviously got into a lot of trouble with people saying that I'm watering down the concept of addiction by applying it to lots of these other behaviours. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to try and conceptualise how I think addictive behaviours operate, how I kind of operationalise, conceptualise them all. I think by my own criteria, very few people are genuinely addicted to the behaviours that I study. Okay, yes, I can tell you now that I've come across many, many gambling addicts in my life, but the number of people who I would say are genuine exercise addicts or genuinely addicted to social networking or dancing are probably few and far between. So even though I get accused of watering down the concept of addiction, I'm going to try and argue today that I don't water it down at all, and I've got kind of strict clinical criteria of any addiction that I look at. Now, I'm just going to start with one of my favourite quotes in the literature, and this was by Burglas and Schaffer, who said that certain individuals use certain substances in certain ways thought at certain times to be unacceptable by certain other individuals for reasons both certain and uncertain. And I love this quote. This just relates to drug addictions. Of course, when we add in behavioural addictions as well, what this kind of says to you is that addiction is a very, very complex process. Okay, now the thing that I don't know, I'm sure people in the room, when they teach their students, I always get my students to operationally define what they mean by addiction or what they operationally mean by addictive personality. I mean, any concept, any kind of thing that they use, they have to operationally define it. Now, when I first started my PhD on slot machine addiction back in 1987, I don't think there was a good definition, okay, that applied in terms of all the textbooks I'd written, all the papers that I'd read. To me, there wasn't what I would call an all-encompassing definition of what it was to be addicted. But a year after I started my PhD, there was a very influential paper published in the Annual Review of Psychology by Gordon Marlett and colleagues. And they had what I thought was actually a really good definition of addiction. And they said that addictive behaviour is a repetitive habit pattern that increases the risk of disease and or associated personal and social problems. It's often experienced subjectively as a loss of control. These habit patterns are typically characterised by by immediate gratification, that's the short-term rewards, often coupled with delayed deleterious effects, the long-term costs, and attempts to actually change that addictive behaviour either via treatment or self-initiation are typically marked by high relapse rates. The reason I love this definition is because I can apply it to things like gambling or video game playing or sex or eating, whatever you want to think about. But for me, this still doesn't go far enough. Okay, it's one thing to have a definition of something, but for me, it became kind of crystal clear to me is that when I a year within doing my PhD, and I was obviously really looking at slot machine gamblers and trying to work out what's the difference between somebody that's playing excessively but with no problems and somebody that's addicted. And there was a very influential guy called Ian Brown around at the time. And Ian was a lecturer up in the Glasgow University, and he was kind of my mentor. He wasn't my PhD supervisor, but he was somebody that I would just write to. At that point, we didn't have email at all back in 1987, 1988. Everything was done by written correspondence. And Ian was developing what he called a components model of addiction. And over the years, I've kind of adapted and modified his original formulation of the components model of addiction and turned it into something that I kind of have popularized. And I don't want to take away the credit from Ian, because Ian definitely put forward in the field the first components model of addiction. Now, any of you that have read my work will know I talk about addictive components. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but before I do that, I just want to mention gambling addiction, okay? Because for me, I've been using the term gambling addiction for 30 years, but it wasn't until 2013 in the American Psychiatric Association's DSM-5 is that gambling was, for the very first time, instead of being called a disorder of impulse control, it was actually classed as a genuine behavioural addiction. Okay, and the reason that came in is because in terms of epidemiological studies, in terms of neuroimaging studies, is that I think most people, even those who worked traditionally in the drug field, admitted that gambling was a behaviour that, when taken to excess, did seem to have the same signs, the same symptoms, the same consequences at a biological level, at a genetic level, as with other more traditional addictions, but also in terms of the kind of psychological effects, sociological effects, etc., is that excessive gambling as an addiction was very much like all these other more traditional addictions. So I've always talked about gambling addiction as being the breakthrough addiction. And the reason I do that is because if you accept the basic premise that gambling is a genuine addiction, and I'm going to obviously argue that it is, if you accept the basic premise that you can become addicted to something that doesn't involve the ingestion of a psychoactive substance, that theoretically opens the floodgates to look at anything else in terms of being a potential addictive behaviour. And of course, as I say, my research has taken me in the area of gaming addiction, internet addiction, sex addiction, etc. And so for me, this was, actually to be acknowledged by the American Psychiatric Association for the first time to say, yes, this is a genuine addiction. We think that it is just like other kinds of substances. And what really unites the field of addiction is, although that every single addiction has kind of idiosyncrasies, it's actually the similarities rather than the dissimilarities that unite this particular field. Okay, so I say there will be a number of you in the room that are very well aware of the addiction components model that I've developed over the last 20 years or so, okay? My kind of argument is, I don't care what the behavior is, okay? The behavior can be absolutely any behavior, but if any behavior fulfills these 6 components, then I would operationalize that behavior as a genuine addictive behavior. Okay, so it's not, and for me also I ought to add, is that you have to endorse all 6 to actually be classed as a genuine addict by my conceptualization. So if you only fulfill 5 of those, by my reckoning is that you're not addicted to that activity unless you can demonstrate all 6. Okay? And to be honest, when I apply this to things like internet addiction or video game addiction, actually very few people endorse all 6 items. So I don't think I'm watering down the concept of addiction at all. I think I'm using genuine clinical criteria that are well established in the drug field and applying it to other behaviours. So the first component there, salience. And what I mean by salience is that this is the single most important thing in this person's life. Here is something that somebody will do to the neglect of everything else in their life. What we're talking about here is total preoccupation with the behaviour. Okay? Even if you're not actually doing the behaviour, you're thinking about the next time that you're going to do it. Now, to demonstrate salience, I'm going to take 3 quotes from 3 real people. These are all what I would say are genuine slot machine addicts. These are actually from people aged between 16 and 18. Okay, so these are young gamblers who I think are genuinely addicted to slot machines. Now, the first example here is a guy that I've called Tony. Okay, and Tony said, if I wasn't actually gambling, I was spending the rest of my time working out clever little schemes to obtain money to feed my habit. These 2 activities literally took up all my time. Okay, now this is very similar to, say, a heroin addict. I mean, a heroin addict does not sit around all day mainlining. Okay, is that obviously heroin is probably the single most important thing in their life, and when they're not actually engaged in heroin use, they're probably thinking, where do I get my next fix from? How can I afford to get my next fix? I probably haven't got the money to do it. This quote here, for me, is an example of preoccupation. Okay, here we've got somebody, if I wasn't actually gambling, I was spending the rest of my time working out clever little schemes to obtain money to feed my habit. This, for me, is a really good example of salience. The second quote here from a guy that I've called Brian, and Brian said, gamble, gamble, gamble your life away. You might as well have put it down the drain. You've got to face the truth that you're having a love affair, and it's with a machine whose lights flash, takes your money, and kills your soul. This is an example of what I would call electronic friendship. Okay? I would actually argue is that, a lot of slot machine addicts particularly, they actually have emotional relationships with the slot machines, okay? There was a particular gambler, in fact, it's a gambler I'm going to talk about in the very next slide, a guy that I've called David. David was somebody that when he went into an amusement arcade and somebody was on his machine, it felt like somebody was making love to his girlfriend. That's how he described it to me. He basically said, this is my machine. I'm the one who plays this. Nobody else should play this. I do this for 10 hours a day, every day. Okay? This is an example of electronic friendship, and I've applied it to my work on everything from people who have addictions to their smartphones and iPods through to things like video games and other electronic devices. But probably the best example of salience I could give you is this last quote. And say, this is a guy that I knew for 7 or 8 years. Okay, this was a really tragic case. He's probably one of the most serious, hardcore slot machine addicts I've ever come across in my life. Now, David said that during 4 or 5 years of compulsive gambling, I think I missed about 6 or 7 days of playing fruit machines. In England, we call slot machines fruit machines. Keeping in mind that about 4 or 5 of those days were Christmas days where it was impossible to gain access to a gambling machine. As you've probably gathered, I ate, slept and breathed gambling machines. I couldn't even find time to spend with the people that I loved. These machines were more important than anything or anyone else. Okay? This was a guy who was very clever. He was academically one of the most gifted people in his school at the time. He's somebody that was captain of the school swimming team, very, very athletic. He was somebody who his parents used to drop him off for swimming practice in a place called Torquay, which is in England. What happened is that while he was waiting for his parents to pick him up after his swimming practice, he started playing on the slot machines that were in this family leisure centre. And I ought to just say in England, we have a very bizarre situation, is that in family leisure centres and in amusement arcades, is that any age can play on a slot machine. 3-year-old children are legally allowed to play on a slot machine in an English seaside arcade or in a family leisure centre. Okay, this doesn't happen anywhere else in the world as far as I know, but we are very unique, and people wonder why we've got one of the biggest adolescent gambling problems, and it's because we legally allow children to play on slot machines in England. Now anyway, then it got to a point where his parents would drop him off for swimming practice and then pick him up 3 hours later, but instead of going swimming, he then spent the 3 hours just playing on the machines. Okay, then it got to a point is that he started truanting from school. He would spend all his day basically playing on the machines. Now, of course, he could not afford to do this. How did he fund his slot machine habit? He started engaging in crime. Okay, he started robbing houses in his area, stealing things, selling them to actually fund his gambling habit. Okay, the thing is, what was interesting from my perspective, when I talked to his parents about David's behaviour, they first were aware that gambling was a problem when the police turned up at his parents' house and they'd caught David shoplifting in a shop. Okay? David had said to the police officers, the reason I shoplift is that I sell this stuff and then I use the money to play on slot machines. Now, when the police officers told David's parents about this, the first reaction from the parents was, thank God for that, we thought it was drugs. Which was very interesting. It was almost like there's a hierarchy. We'd prefer our child to be addicted to slot machines rather than drugs. I mean, his parents told me is that there was nothing in David's bedroom at all. He had sold his record player, he'd sold all, everything that was in his room, he had sold in order to play on one particular machine. He had a favourite machine. Okay, he would go into this arcade and he would just play all day, every day with money that he had. On his 18th birthday, this guy got a motorcycle as a birthday present from his parents. The next day, one day after his 18th birthday, he sold that motorcycle for just £2,000, which actually was very cheap to sell it, and every single penny of that £2,000 went into one machine in an arcade in Torbay. Okay, now what I'm trying to say here is this is a very extreme case. So I don't think I've ever come across a case. This was a guy who ended up in prison as a result of all the crimes he committed to fund his fruit machine, his slot machine addiction. If you accept the basic premise that this person was genuinely addicted to a slot machine in the same way that other people are addicted to heroin or nicotine or alcohol, what we're saying here is that you can become addicted to a behaviour. You can become addicted to something that doesn't involve the ingestion of a psychoactive substance. And if you accept that basic premise, it goes to back what I was saying before, is there is no theoretical reason why somebody couldn't become addicted to exercise or couldn't become addicted to work or sex or video game playing or the internet. Okay, so that's just my first component. Okay, I've got 5 others to go here. So the second component there, mood modification. I personally believe that every single addiction involves people modifying their mood either, and this is a paradox actually, either people use that behaviour or use that substance to get high, to get aroused, to get buzzed up, excited, or they do it for the exact opposite, to tranquilise, to numb, to escape, to de-stress, to relax. And in fact, people can use different substances and different behaviours at different times of the day to get completely different effects. So I know a lot of people that are addicted to nicotine. Okay, when I talk to my friends who smoke, they will say that their first cigarette in the morning or their first couple of cigarettes in the morning, that gives them a kind of nicotine rush to get them going for the day. But by the end of the day, they're not using those cigarettes to kind of get a rush or a high, they're using it to de-stress, to tranquilize, to escape. So here is an example of somebody using, even though we know obviously nicotine as a stimulant, is that people can use it actually for its kind of non-stimulant properties. We know that alcohol is a depressant of the central nervous system, yet people can use it to feel euphoric. And one of the things I've argued in my writings is that to some extent psychology can override physiology, is that people can use these substances and they can use these behaviours at different times of the day to get completely different effects. Now, one of the things I got criticised for, particularly in the early 2000s, is that, particularly from the drugs field, they said, Mark, we heard you speak on your behavioural addictions, but people that we studied, heroin addicts, alcoholics, addicted smokers, these people, that this activity is not the most important thing in their life. They don't think about it all the time. And they were true, and that was true. But the thing I argued, in a paper that I wrote in 2005, I introduced a concept called reverse salience. And this was specifically in relation to drug addictions. Because the thing about drug addictions is that people who have them are able to engage in their drug of choice, but they can actually do it concurrently while they're doing other activities. So it could be that I'm an alcoholic. Right, so this glass here. Now, if I was an alcoholic, this could be neat vodka, neat gin. I could quite easily come in as an alcoholic and give this lecture, okay, and you would be none the wiser that I was actually addicted to my drug of choice, because my drug of choice is right next to me. Now, obviously, it is just water, but what I'm trying to... So, for instance, I've come across people who are alcoholic pathological gamblers. You can easily play a slot machine all day and drink at the same time. Okay? Now, the thing is, if I'm an addicted smoker, okay, if I'm on a 24-hour plane flight from England to New Zealand, I can tell you now that nicotine does become the single most important thing in my life because I'm prevented from engaging in my drug of choice. This is why I call drug addiction, I call it reverse salience, is that drug addicts, whether it's heroin, whether it's alcohol, whether it's nicotine, they do not become aware that this is the most important thing in their life until they are prevented from doing it. And of course, there are very few occasions where they're prevented from doing it in day-to-day life. So it's not something they naturally think about all the time, but in fact they are totally preoccupied, and they only becomes consciously aware when they're prevented from smoking, or they're prevented from drinking, or they're prevented from taking their drug of choice. So the third component here, tolerance. Okay, now I know that some more recent addiction models, they don't actually mention tolerance anymore, but I personally still think that tolerance is a really core concept to addiction. Okay, this idea that you need more and more of this initial, you need more and more of this substance or more and more of this behavior to get those same initial mood-modifying experiences. So the heroin addict who started taking a very small amount of heroin, 6 months later might be taking 6 times as much to get those same effects that he got with a much smaller amount 6 months before. In my work on gambling, what we typically see is people gambling for longer and longer periods every day, betting with bigger and bigger bet sizes. I would argue that tolerance is, you can demonstrate tolerance even in behavioural addictions, whether it's the more and more playing of a video game, more and more exercise, more and more work. Is obviously there's always a natural point where you can't do any more, but what we typically find is that over time, people do increase the amount of behaviour or they increase the amount of drugs they take to get those same initial mood-modifying experiences. And again, withdrawal. For me, somebody that does something all the time, then stops it, but does not get any withdrawal symptoms, for me, that is not a genuine addiction. Okay, so in my work on gambling, I can tell you now that I've come across pathological gamblers, people who I think are genuinely addicted to gambling, and on a psychological level, when they're unable to gamble, they will experience increased moodiness, increased irritability, increased frustration, increased aggression. On a physiological level, these same gamblers, they will have hand sweats, they will have nausea, stomach cramps, they will have anxiety attacks. Okay, there'll be lots of actually physical effects that you might associate with more traditional withdrawal effects in things like alcohol, nicotine, or other illicit drugs, but we do find them in gamblers, in gamers, etc. And again, because so few, for instance, video gamers have withdrawal effects when they stop playing video games, is a lot of the time they don't fulfill my criteria of being genuinely addicted to games. Okay, and one of the things I would like to point out is that obviously whether it's gaming, whether it's gambling, whether it's sex, whether it's work, okay, what we're talking about is a behaviour that is on a continuum from absolutely no problems at all through to quite pathological behaviour at the other end. And one of the things I always say is that, I come across many people who I would term problematic video game players. okay? But the thing is, they're not addicted by my criteria, okay? I always say that all video game addicts are problematic gamers, but not all gamers are not all problem gamers are addicts, okay? And this is because things are on a continuum. Now, I'll just give you, so that's to do with withdrawal symptoms, but it's actually the fifth component here, okay, conflict, which is the single most important component of the addiction components model, because what we're talking about here is an activity that's so conflicting in this person's life that they do it to the neglect of everything else. It compromises their job or their schoolwork or their university work, their college work, depending on what age they are. It compromises their relationships with other people, your romantic partner, your family. It compromises all their other hobbies. Okay, what we're talking about is an activity that completely takes over this person's life. Now, interestingly, okay, and I really want to stress this, is that the amount of time that somebody is engaged in a behavioural addiction, okay, that's a bit of a red herring to me, in the sense that just because you do something excessively does not necessarily mean it's bad. Okay, for me, what the critical thing is, people always ask me, okay, Mark, what's the difference between a healthy excessive enthusiasm and an addiction? And for me, it's very simple. Healthy excessive enthusiasms add to life and addictions take away from it. Okay, now just by that simple rule of thumb, most of the excessive gamers I've ever met have little or no problems in their life. Now again, back in 2010, I published a paper which I'm very proud of. Okay, it was actually just a short paper comparing two case studies of two gamers who were both playing up to 14 hours a day, every single day, on an online video game. Okay, now the first guy, okay, this was a guy who was 21 years old. He'd just left university. At the time, he had no partner, no children, and from the moment he woke up until he went to bed, he would play nothing but a game. Well, in fact, this particular game was World of Warcraft. I'm sure most people in the room have heard of World of Warcraft. But this was a game that within the game, he was revered, he was lauded. He had really high self-esteem because of how good he was in this game. Okay? Now, you might say, well, the reason he didn't have a job, a partner, children, because he was playing this game all day. Okay? Obviously, he just left university, but he did this for about 6 months. Now, he saw me on a television program in England, and he emailed me and said, Mark, I'm fed up of people like you pathologizing my behavior. Now, the first thing I said to this guy, I said, I don't even know you. I'm not pathologizing your behavior at all. Okay? So I wrote to him, and I actually sent him one of my papers, and I said, here are my criteria. Okay, how many of these do you fulfill? Now, he wrote back to me, he said, there's 3 of those that I fulfill. He said that gaming was the single most important thing in his life. He told me that he basically played the games for mood-modifying experiences, and that over time, he had built up, he started off playing half an hour a day, and now he was playing up to 14 hours a day every single day. So he only endorsed 3 of my 6 components. And I said to him, well, by my definition, you are not addicted to this game. Okay, I actually said to him, obviously this is a really important thing in your life, okay, but you don't seem to have any long-term negative detrimental effects from the fact that you're playing this all day, every single day. This guy, and I say I still know him, he now married somebody he met in the game. Okay, he now works in the computer game industry. Okay, this is somebody that just absolutely loved playing the games. But as he said, when I met my partner online and we went, we were off doing other things, going to the cinema, we didn't miss gaming. We just absolutely loved gaming when we did it. Okay, when I got my first job, obviously the amount of gaming that I was actually doing cut down dramatically. He said I can still play marathon sessions at the weekends, but during the week I had very little time to play. What he was telling me was that he had no withdrawal symptoms if he had to stop. Okay, this wasn't something that was causing him any negative detrimental effects in his life. Now, that person was claiming, okay, and I do believe him, that he was playing up to 14 hours a day every single day. Now, I compared him with another behaviourally identical person. Now, this person was 38. This person was somebody who was married with 2 children. This was somebody who had a very high-pressured job in London. Okay? This was somebody who used to get his wife to ring in and say, I'm really sorry, but my husband can't come in today because he's ill. He wasn't ill. He was sitting playing a game called EverQuest. Okay? This was a guy that his wife turned around to him and said, if you do not stop playing this stupid game, and that was her words, this stupid game, I'm going to leave you and I'm going to take our kids with me. This is what happened. She left him. He got sacked from his job because he never turned up. Okay? The only way he could cope with the fact that his wife and children had left him, that he had no job, was just carry on playing the game. It was kind of like a vicious circle. Now, the thing I'm trying to make a point here is that those 2 people were, in terms of their playing behaviour, were absolutely identical. But the second guy fulfilled all of my 6 criteria, but the first guy only fulfilled 3. The second guy had loads of negative impact in his life as a result. You know, as I say, he couldn't do his job, he couldn't maintain his relationship. This was something that completely takes over his life. So one thing I always talk about when I talk about addictive behaviours, it's not to do with the amount of time that you're engaged with, it's to do with the context and the content of what you're actually doing. Okay, now I say it's a 21-year-old guy who's got no partner, no children, no job. Okay, the fact they might play games all day or do anything all day to the neglect of everything else does not make it necessarily problematic. I'm not saying that if he did it for the next 5 years, he might not, he might have become obese, there might have been some health problems. But as he said to me, he said, the point is, I choose to do this activity. I choose to play World of Warcraft every day. As I say, people, they just worship me in the game because of how good I am. You know, I'm leader of this clan, I'm leader of this guild. Okay, this is the most important thing in my life, but I love it and I can stop it at any time I want. And he's obviously gone on to show that. And then finally, we have relapse. Okay, so if you have managed to give up for 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months, even 2 years, what I would expect to find if you're genuinely addicted to a particular behaviour or a particular substance is that when you start doing it again, you go straight back into the addictive cycles you were in before. Now, Mark Twain, the American author who wrote Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, he's got a lovely quote, and he says that giving up smoking is really easy to do. I've done it hundreds of times. Okay, and for me, that, smoking is the classic relapse behaviour, but we do find that, and I found it in my work on video gaming addiction, on gambling addiction, exercise addiction, even work addiction, is that people do, and obviously work and exercise are really interesting because obviously no one would say to you, work is the only activity that we're actually made to do for 8 hours a day. Nobody makes you gamble or game for 8 hours a day, but work is something we have to do if you're in a full-time job, 8 hours every single day. Exercise is another one. I would never say to somebody, you should not, if you're an exercise addict, you shouldn't exercise again. Okay? These are what I would call mixed blessings addictions. Okay? Again, this is something I borrowed from the guy Ian Brown that I was talking about earlier. Because Ian Brown talked about work addictions, exercise addictions, as being these activities that actually can have some very positive effects. But in fact, what distinguishes an addiction from something that's a healthy enthusiasm is over the long term, the kind of long-term disadvantages start to outweigh the short-term advantages. Now, as again, people call me a workaholic. Yes, I love what I do, but the honest answer is, and I was talking to Attila in the car last night, and I was saying, when my first child was born, I suddenly went from working 10 to 14 hours a day down to 7 or 8 hours a day. I actually could not fit in any more work after the birth of my first child. Okay, for 10 years, I never worked more than 7 or 8 hours a day because I wanted to see my children grow up. I wanted to bath them every night. I wanted to read them a story. Okay, now my youngest child is now 15. I am now quite happily again working 10 hours a day and I love what I do. But it's not interfering negatively at all in my life. So by my criteria, okay, I would not be addicted to work. But I know colleagues who are probably going to be prone to coronary heart disease, to heart attacks, etc., because they're using their work to compensate for other deficiencies in their life. They're using it to the fact they're in a bad relationship with their partner and that basically they work 12 hours a day to actually avoid engaging in their relationship. That behaviour says me more about their relationship than it does about the work being addicted. So again, it goes back to this thing. It's not about the amount of hours you do doing something. It's about the context, the contact and impact on the rest of your life. Now, obviously, one of the things I'm very proud of in terms of the addiction components model is that this has been used in lots of different arenas of behavioural addiction. We've developed lots of different instruments over the years. So, for instance, the very first one, and again, Attila's in the audience, we developed something called the Exercise Addiction Inventory back in 2004. What's lovely now, this has been translated into many languages, it's been used all over the world, and it's just based on the 6 addiction components. But this has been applied to everything from problematic pornography use through to things like gaming, work, social networking, etc. And for me, I'm very proud that this has been taken on all over the world. Now, I'm not saying these instruments are perfect, and obviously we know that any kind of epidemiological study we do, we have these instruments. None of us can say that just because we might find in a big sample that, say, 2% appear to be addicted to social networking or gambling or gaming. None of our papers say these people are definitely addicted. What we're saying is that this may be indicative of problems. We never, none of our kind of surveys that we do, we never say these people are addicted. We might have an operational definition and say that anyone who scored 5 or more out of these 8 items might have a problem or be addicted, but we never say these people are addicted. And you can only do that through a structured clinical interview. Now, what I wanted to do, I want to just spend the next kind of 15, 20 minutes just talking about gambling. Okay, because I said, I'm trying to argue already to you, is that gambling, for me, when it's taken to excess and causes problems, is just like a more genuine addiction. Now, in England, okay, what's very interesting is that what was called our Home Office, okay, the Home Office, they, at the time, back in the mid-1990s, this was the government department that oversaw gambling regulation and gambling legislation in the UK. And it was the reason that obviously gambling is something that has to be regulated, and it has to be, you know, because it's a consumptive behaviour just like alcohol and cigarettes, is I personally believe, for instance, that nobody under the age of 18 should be able to gamble. Okay, we in the UK, in England, we have one of the highest prevalence rates of problem gambling in the world because we legally allow our children to play on slot machines. Back in the mid-1990s is that we introduced a national lottery, we introduced scratch cards. Okay, and the government actually said that these are soft forms of gambling, and we're going to allow people who are 16 and over to actually engage in these particular activities. And they distinguished everything between what they called hard forms of gambling and soft forms of gambling. And what they actually said is that things like advertising and marketing, we will allow you to advertise and market things like scratch cards and things like lotteries because these are soft forms of gambling. Now, what was really interesting for me, I said right at the start of this talk, is for me the most crucial thing when we talk about things like addiction, we have to operationally define it. Interestingly, in 1996, the Home Office, for the very first time, they actually operationally defined what the difference was between hard and soft forms of gambling. And they said that hard gambling is a colloquialism for those forms of gambling which are considered to carry greater potential risk than others. And I just want to stress this because of high or rapid staking associated with them. Now, I just want to concentrate on those two words, high or rapid staking. For me, high or rapid staking means that this is an activity that if you have the time, the money, and the resources, you can gamble again and again and again without anyone stopping you doing it. So, for instance, slot machines would count as a hard form of gambling because if I've got the time, the money, and resources, I can just gamble again and again and again. Now, on a bi-weekly national lottery, you can't gamble. You can buy lots of tickets, but you can't keep gambling again and again and again because the result of your gamble is only twice a week. In England, the results of our national lotto game are on a Wednesday night and on a Saturday night. So there's only 2 times a week you can actually gamble. Now, the thing is that I wrote to the Home Office and I said, I've just seen your new definition of hard and soft forms of gambling. Now, the thing is, you're now advertising scratch cards every night on television. I said, by your definition, scratch cards are something that is a hard form of gambling by your definition, because if people can buy, basically they can play, you know, can scratch off, do another one, and I actually described these back in 1995. I said scratch cards were actually paper slot machines. The psychology behind them are actually very, very similar. Now, the interesting thing is that I wrote a letter to the Home Office and I said, why was it you were allowing the advertising of hard forms of gambling, by your definition, every night on British television? And they wrote back to me and said, you know, dear Dr. Griffiths, thank you very much for your letter. We can categorically state that scratch cards are not a hard form of gambling because, and I quote, they are sold in respectable outlets. That was the reason I was given, okay? So I then wrote back to them, I said, does that mean if we put a roulette wheel or a slot machine in Tesco, it suddenly becomes a soft form of gambling? And of course, they didn't respond to that particular letter that I sent. But again, now, to be honest, this argument is now null and void because now we allow any form of gambling to be advertised on British TV. From the 1st of September 2007, we now have mass gambling advertising every single day. But for me, one of the things I've been very interested in is that, and people say that one thing I don't ever do is that I never nail my theoretical colours to the mast. When I talk about addictions, I'm talking about a very integrated behaviour between, excuse me. I'm talking about a behaviour, oh, I've lost my voice. Right, I'm talking about a behaviour that involves what I call individual factors, structural factors, and situational factors. God, I'll get my voice back in a minute. Right, put more simply, I'm going to take the example of gambling behaviour. And I'm going to argue is that there are 3 competing sets of characteristics that I feel are fundamental in terms of the acquisition, development and maintenance, not just of that behaviour, but also of that addictive behaviour. Now, in the gambling world, I would say that at least 95% of all research that's ever been carried out on gambling looks at the individual characteristics. It looks at a person's personality, their attitudes, their expectations. It looks at the environment they were brought up in. Okay? It looks at things like genetic and biological predispositions. Okay? Now, interestingly, all over the world now is that the gambling industry is starting to fund various forms of research, various research programs. Interestingly, most of the research programs they fund are only to look at those individual characteristics. They want a gene to be identified as a reason for why people gamble improperly and gamble addictively. They want it to be something to do with their personality. They want it to be doing something with a person's kind of cognitive thinking. Now, I say about 5% of all the research in gambling has actually looked at what we call the situational and structural characteristics, and this is where I've done most of my research on gambling. So if we take situational characteristics, the yellow box down there, I've argued in my writings there are two fundamentally different forms of situational characteristic. There are what I call the macro situational characteristics. So these are things like advertising, marketing, where you actually locate your gambling venues. Do you put your gambling venue next to a school or a college? You know, are you really cynical that this is where I can make money by situating my gambling venue to a vulnerable population? But there are also what I would call micro-situational characteristics. So these are how psychology is used within a particular gambling environment. Maybe the lights, the sounds, the noises, the decor, etc. I'll come back to that in a minute. So there are two fundamentally different forms of situational characteristic. But there's also what I would call, which when we talk about addiction, far more important to me are the structural characteristics. These are the things that are actually designed, developed, implemented into particular games to get you to gamble again and again and again. Okay, what we're looking at here is repetitive habit-forming behaviour. So I could actually spend the next 2 hours, obviously I'm not going to do this, I could spend the next 2 hours talking about all the research that's been done on looking at these individual characteristics of gambling. So, you know, we know there are cognitive perspectives, we know there are psychobiological perspectives, developmental perspectives, social perspectives. I'm not in any way trying to say that none of these things are important. They're all important at some level. Okay? All I want to say on this particular slide is we all know that there are certain personality characteristics that we tend to associate with addictions. We know that things like high neuroticism scores, low conscientiousness scores, you tend to, whatever addiction you're looking at, whether it's gambling addiction, heroin addiction, alcohol addiction, we know there are some personality characteristics that are associated with addictive behavior. I'm not trying to diminish any of that. But for me, one of the things I try and do is I work as a consultant for many different, particularly online gambling firms. And one of the things I try and make them do is they have to take social responsibility for a product that causes problems to a minority of people. Okay, for me, the most important thing when I'm talking with these gambling companies is player protection, harm minimization, responsible gambling. Okay, now, when I talk about situational characteristics, there are so many different situational characteristics, but I would argue that if you put a cash point machine, an ATM, on the gambling floor, that this is socially irresponsible to do. Right? Now, in my local casino, I play roulette, and it takes me 2 seconds to get from the roulette table to the cash machine to get more money out. Okay, to me, this is a socially irresponsible thing to do. But this is a situational characteristic that does make people gamble more. I've seen people playing roulette, all their money goes down in the hole. What do? They just go to the cash machine, get another £50 out, give it to the croupier, change it for chips, and they're gambling again straight away. I've also seen things like when I've been in Las Vegas, Atlantic City, people coming around and giving you free alcohol while you're playing on a slot machine or playing a gaming table. Again, for me, this is a situational characteristic that is socially irresponsible. I'll just mention one more thing. Okay, I've got their floor layout. Okay, I remember the first time I stayed at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. This is a hotel, one of the biggest hotels in the world, 5,005 rooms in the MGM Grand. Now, I went to see a band called REM play in the MGM Grand. And from the second that I walked through the doors, okay, of the casino to get to the arena where REM were playing, it took me 25 minutes to walk to get to that arena. In that time, I passed thousands of slot machines and gaming tables. And obviously, when the concert finished, there was another 25 minutes to get back out of the casino. Okay? These are what I would call situational characteristics that, you know, there was 50 minutes there walking to the arena and walking back where I was exposed to all these different forms of gambling. Now, I didn't succumb to that, but I'm sure there'll be lots of people who either on the way or the way back would actually succumb because of that situational characteristic. But where I think, when I talk about addiction, I think what is far more important are the structural characteristics, okay? Now, there is one particular structural characteristic that I talk about again and again in the work that I do, and that is on the top left-hand side there, event frequency. For me, event frequency is absolutely critical in terms of any addiction that I can think of, okay? For me, addictions are all about constant rewards, constant reinforcement. Okay, you cannot become addicted to something unless you're being rewarded all the time in some way. Now, it might be escaping kind of negative consequences, or it might actually be positive reinforcement. It doesn't matter what kind of reinforcement or reward system is there. For me, you cannot become addicted to a gambling activity, for instance, like the National Lotto game. Okay, I don't think I've ever met a single lotto player who is genuinely addicted to playing lotto. Yes, I've come across people who spend far too much money buying tickets, buying the tickets to engage in lottery, but the thing is they can only be rewarded for that behaviour on a Wednesday night and on a Saturday night. You compare that with a slot machine. Okay, a slot machine, you can gamble on a British slot machine 12 times a minute on a British slot machine. Okay, online, there are some online slot machines you can gamble for 30 or 40 times a minute on some of the online slot machines. Okay? So what I'm saying here is that activities that have very high event frequencies tend to be more associated with problematic and addictive gambling. Now, one thing you might be saying, so what you're telling us, Mark, is that slot machines are addictive and lotteries aren't. And in fact, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is to do with the structural characteristics of that activity, because I could design you the safest slot machine, and I guarantee no one will ever become addicted to it. And how will I do that? Is I will open a whole load of slot machines, and when you come into my gambling venue, when you come up to the machine, you'll only be able to press the button once on a Wednesday night and once on a Saturday night. I guarantee no one will ever become addicted to a slot machine where you can only press the button twice a week. Okay? I could also create the single most addictive lottery game, and instead of having the lottery draw once on a Wednesday night and once on a Saturday night, I'll have the lottery draw every single minute. I'll have a new draw every single minute. Now, you might say I'm being facetious and silly, but in fact, in America, in Canada, New Zealand and Australia, they have that already. It's a game called Keno. This is a high event frequency lottery where the draw is every 2 minutes. And I can tell you now, people do develop problems to those types of lottery. So it's not about the game. I published a very controversial paper back in 2013 where I talked about the irrelevancy of game type in the acquisition, development and maintenance of problem gambling. People thought I was mad, because there's loads and loads of research showing that slot machines are basically the crack cocaine of gambling. But the thing I argued is that the only reason they're the crack cocaine of gambling is because of the high event frequencies. And of course, I could create a lottery product or a roulette product where I could have just as equally high event frequencies. Now, if you couple the event frequency, go back to the bottom left here, something that we psychologists call the psychology of the near miss. Okay, now this is, sorry for the bad graphic here, but let's just say you're playing a slot machine. I think most people who play a slot machine, they know that what they're trying to do is match up all the same symbols in the win line, the middle line of playing a slot machine. So here we've got an example where you've got to match 5 sevens all in a row, but we've got 2 sevens just above the pay line. This is what we psychologists call a near miss. Okay? Now, in some slot machines now, it isn't even just about horizontal, is that sometimes you can win money by having diagonals as well as horizontals. The point, what I'm trying to make here is that lots and lots of near-miss experiences are deliberately programmed into slot machines, into scratch cards, okay, basically to give you this idea, okay, that you've nearly won all the time, okay. Now, again, if I take the example of scratch cards, okay, so here we've got, usually what you do have to do on a scratch card is either match up all the same symbols in the same line or 3 symbols across the whole card. So again, we've got here a piece of melon that's obviously just below the top line there. Here are these are some real cards. So this is a scratch card that I bought a number of years ago. So if I'm scratching off from the top, I've got to match 3 symbols of the same amount of money to win that amount of money. So I scratch off the first line, I've got 2 hundreds. I've only got to get 100 in the second line or the third line. I scratch off the middle line, 225. So if a 25 or 100 comes up in the third line, I've won. Now I'm building up excitement here. But then, of course, I didn't win. Okay, now, this costs nothing to the operators to do. Okay, this is something that is used all the time. This was a card. This is actually called a heart stopper. I actually thought for about a second I'd won on this. I thought I'd won £1,000. Because it wasn't a symbol, basically, with all the noughts there, I actually thought I'd won £1,000. Literally, my heart was going the clappers, and then I realised I hadn't won it. Okay? Now, this company actually went out of business. Maybe it's because in Britain they can't even spell the word lucky properly. They've got, anyway, that's irrelevant. But the point is that the question I always get asked, particularly by the media, Mark, why do people continually gamble if they continually lose? And you've got to remember is that gamblers never continually lose. Gamblers continually nearly win. Now, the thing what I've shown in my research is that people, their heart rates, their arousal, they get just as buzzed up, high and aroused, not only when they win, but also when they nearly win. Really, and it costs the operators absolutely nothing to do this whatsoever. And again, the great thing about the near miss, even if you don't deliberately program them into your products, is that what problem gamblers do is that they create near misses for themselves. So I'm just going to give you an example. This is if I play a lotto game, okay, in England we have to choose 6 numbers, okay, out of 59 different selections. So my partner, her birthday's 16th of February. She plays the lottery every single week. Okay, the other numbers are related with our kids' birthdays, her birthday. She chooses the same numbers every week. Now, when the number 16 comes up, if the number 17 or 15 comes up, that could be translated by that person as a near win. If the number 6, 26, 36, 46 or 56 comes up, you could actually count that as a near win. If the number 19 comes up, it's almost like a 1 and an upside down 6. Somebody might think that is a near miss. Now, the thing about this is that we, as you know, I see this all the time, particularly amongst sports gamblers. Okay, so when people have put a bet on a match that a particular team is going to win, okay, is they put 20 euros on the game, okay, and what they'll do is that when after the game they've lost that money, they will say to themselves, yeah, but if the referee had not given that penalty in the 67th minute, I would have won. What they're doing, they're creating what are clear losing situations into near winning ones, and the near winning is actually still psychologically reinforcing. And again, can I just say, I mean, near misses, event frequency, these are really critical to me in terms of development of problem gambling. But there are lots of things that are used, which I'm not saying that they developed in terms of problem gambling, but they are factors that are very important in terms of you actually playing those things in the first place. So in England, we have loads and loads of different types of slot machine. Here's one which is based on the Addams Family film. Okay, we've got machines that are based on The Simpsons. We've got them based on famous board games like Trivial Pursuit. We've got them based on our top-viewed soap operas, Coronation Street, EastEnders. The thing about these is that when people go into a gambling venue, is that usually these machines, they are playing the theme tunes from these programs or these films. So I can walk into a pub in England and I hear the da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. That's supposed to be the Simpsons theme tune. The point is that we immediately attenuate towards that machine. Even though we may have never played it before, we suddenly know something about it. Okay, The Simpsons is universally popular across gender and across age, and to be honest, it's probably across cultures as well. The Simpsons machines are the single most profitable slot machines in the UK, and they use the psychology of familiarity to get people to play them in the first place. In fact, familiarity is used right across the industry. Camelot, who run our national lottery, they actually say in their marketing material they will never ever have any product that is in any way attractive to a child. And yet they produce scratch cards based on Pirates of the Caribbean, Star Wars, James Bond. Here's one from Lord of the Rings. Okay, I chose this one because my son at the time, who was 8 years old, he's now 15, he was obsessed with Lord of the Rings. Whenever we went into any shop, he said, Daddy, can you buy me that card? I want Legolas. I want Gandalf or whatever. Okay, he wasn't really interested in the gambling, but he wanted to collect the cards. Okay, now when I challenged Camelot, the operator, about this, they said, oh no, these are actually trying to appeal to adults who want to regress back to childhood, to think about that carefree time when they had no worries in the world. Anyway, the point is I've lost that battle. They're still using scratch cards, which I think are attractive to underage children. But I'll just mention a couple more things and I'll stop and we'll open it up for some questions. One of the things I'm particularly interested in is top right-hand corner there that I've called suspension of judgment, credits. One thing that the gambling industry does all the time is it tries to turn your real cash into virtual representations of it as quickly as possible. Now, the reason they do this is to lower the psychological value of the money. So when I play a slot machine, I put in my money and it turns into credits. When I'm playing online, is that my euros or my pounds, they're turned into credits. Okay, when I'm playing roulette at a table, my money is turned into chips. Okay, now, say, why don't we put money at the table? The industry say they do it, it's for security issues. But in fact, the industry know that it lowers the psychological value of the money. So for instance, we did some experiments at Nottingham Trent that we published. And we showed that if you give students money to gamble with and chips to gamble with, even though they have to give us the money back at the end of the experiment, is that they gambled far more with chips than they did with real money. And if you don't believe me that using virtual representations doesn't lower the psychological value of the money, next time that you buy that pair of trousers that you want or that dress, don't pay it with your credit or your debit card. Pay it out in notes, in foreign notes. It will seem like much more than when you pay for it on a card. Okay, and the industry use this all the time. So last slide I'm going to put up today. Okay, so my conclusion. What I've tried to argue today, I've used the example of gambling, and I've tried to argue that if you accept that gambling, when taken to excess, can be a genuine addiction, okay, you open the floodgate to look at any other behaviour as a potential addiction. So I've tried to say that behavioural addictions can and they do exist, and I've used gambling to try and argue that. I think that some behavioural addictions may be more serious than others depending on the context. So I've said that things like exercise addiction, work addiction might actually have some positive benefits, whereas something like gambling, the point if you gamble for 12 hours a day, not only do you take up all that time, but you actually spend lots and lots of money as well. And I think that's one of the reasons why gambling addiction is a far more destructive addiction than things like exercise addiction or video game addiction, because of just the sheer amount of money that you spend if you're doing it all day, every day. I've tried to argue that addiction is a very complex process, that yes, basically the biology plus the psychology plus the sociology is important in the acquisition, development and maintenance of behavioural addictions. But what I want to just stress, and this is the very last point here, is what I've tried to show is that situational and structural characteristics are also important in the acquisition, development and maintenance of behavioural addictions, and that addiction doesn't really just reside within the individual, because these situational and structural characteristics also play a role as well. And that's the end. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very
Pleasure.
much
Absolute
once
pleasure.
more for being here. I hope there will be many further occasions when we can
Absolutely.
invite you and you can come. So, and hopefully we can continue this discussion. And yeah, thank you once more. Also, thank you for your coming, and congratulations one more for your being awarded Honorable Doctor and Professor of the University. Thank you very much.
Thank you.